One of my projected pitchers on the opening day roster may not be looking like he's going to make it due to health. Who is that and who can replace him? Let's find out next on Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for tuning into another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can give me a follow on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. You also can find us on wherever you get your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Google Podcast. We're on Odyssey. We're also on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors and FanDuel, and we've got plenty more on them coming up throughout today's show. If you're a first-time listener, of course, welcome in. We love the new listeners here on the Locked On Royals channel. Be sure to subscribe first and foremost, but if you want to know a little bit more about me, I work here in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. Got a show once a week over there, and then Monday through Friday, I got a show on ESPN Kansas City. So if you ever want my thoughts on things that may not always pertain to Major League Baseball or the Royals, you can check me out over there. But when you get to this podcast, when you click on this link, wherever you be listening, you know that you are getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball. And with spring training now in full effect, we know that we are just 1 month away from the start of the regular season. We have almost made it to the point where these games start to matter. And the reason spring training can be so agonizing at times, of course, you can look at the beauty of it. Baseball's back. Arizona and Florida are going to have great weather during this time. Florida has more chances of rain in the spring seasons. Arizona is as dry as the desert that its stadiums are built around. So to me, this feels like a perfect time period for a baseball fan. There's no way around it. When it's spring training, you can just, hear the sounds. You can smell baseball. It's a weird thing to say, but it kind of makes sense if you're a longtime baseball fan. It's the activity. It's everything that goes into it. But the agonizing part of spring training is there's so many meaningless games, so many exhibition games that eventually you grow tired of it. Eventually you grow weary of it. And for people who cover the team, who spend a lot of time watching this team, the worst part about it is that you really can't make any predictions, any projections for this team until you know who they break camp with. And yes, we can lock in some guys that are going to be playing maybe 10, 15, 20 more games on the schedule. We can lock in those guys. We can lock in the Bobby Witt Jr.'s, the Michael Garcias, the Cole Reagans, the Michael Wachas, the Seth Lugos. We can lock in all of those guys, right? But then there's those fringe guys that you may not know if they make the team. And then another layer to that is you don't know who's going to be healthy. You don't know who's going to have that setback. You don't know where that injury is going to occur, because baseball is a sport that, as long as it is, as lack of physicality that it entails, that it involves, there's a lot of injuries that happen in the sport, and they can be so minor at the time. A shoulder tightness, a sore elbow, just not feeling comfortable. And it can always lead to something more that can sideline you for the rest of the season. And that's always the biggest fear, I think, for baseball players, is going through an entire off season and then getting an injury in spring training. Now, the Royals have actually had a couple of guys get bit with the injury bug, or at least a mild version of it. One guy is not going to be pitching now this year. Christian Chamberlain, one of the prospects that had gotten invited to big league camp, tore his UCL. So that's not good news right off the bat. He had seemingly had a great offseason. I believe he was working at Tread, if I'm not mistaken, had a couple of pitches that reached 100 miles an hour. So he was somebody that was showing he could be a future bullpen piece, but now he's not going to get that opportunity. The second guy, and the one who's going to headline our segment today, is Carlos Hernandez. Now, Hernandez, when I was down there in Surprise, wasn't throwing. He was there. I saw him in the clubhouse every single day, but we never saw the live BP. We never saw the next step. And, Annie Rogers and Jalen Thompson that are down there, doing great reporting. They reported that Matt Quatrero wanted to get him out there for a live bullpen session and go from there because he had been dealing with, I believe it was the shoulder tightness or something along the lines of that. And then you get to today and it didn't respond well. His shoulder, that is. And it didn't seem like it was the end of the world. It just seemed like with an injury like this, when you have a setback, it's sometimes a little bit more than what they're giving you. This, to me, screamed Carlos Hernandez is not going to be on the opening day roster. There are going to be other guys now that are fighting for that last spot. And that is going to bring good competition in spring. You're always hoping for good competition in spring. But I would be remiss in saying that not having Carlos Hernandez will be one of those gut punches, I think, when the team breaks camp. I don't think he had a massive role on this team. He certainly wasn't going to be the ninth inning guy anymore. He certainly wasn't going to be the setup guy anymore. But I do think that down the road, he would have had a lot of value for this bullpen. And he still can get there. That's the thing. This is not like Chamberlain's injury where it's a torn UCL, he's sidelined for good. This is just a minor setback in spring training. But the longer you go without getting those reps in, the harder it becomes to make the opening day roster. And I know for Carlos Hernandez that it's very important to amend what he finished the year with last year. It's good for him to bounce back in a strong way. And I do believe he gets there. And maybe I'm one of the few that are higher on him than most. I think his stuff really does play. I think it's electric. And I think when you pieced him together, in the first half, when you had worked with him all offseason long, that's the version that I anticipate him to be. Not so much the second half version when he had to take the place of Scott Barlow. Now we may have to wait and see. Now, I also don't want to go out there and make the prediction already that he's not going to be on the opening day roster. I think it's leaning that way. I think it is showing signs that if he had a setback in a live BP, it wasn't like he was out there pumping 98, 99, 100 in a game. This was just a live BP. So you are at the baby step version of working somebody into spring training. Like all of those guys were doing the live bullpens when pitchers and catchers reported. Carlos Hernandez was one of the guys they needed to ease along. They didn't need to bombard him with a big workload. I just think that this is one of those unfortunate things of spring training. One of many. I mean, let's all be honest here. You can get caught up in the record. You can get caught up in the numbers. But in the end, they're exhibition games. They really don't matter that much. But to me, this is just the worst part about spring training is it's like you look at all your stars, you look at all your studs, and it's like I almost wish that they just had the regular season because nothing is worse than losing a guy or having injuries happen in spring training because those games are meaningless. They're important to the younger players, guys fighting for a spot, and I do think Carlos Hernandez had to earn his spot. In Surprise, I think he couldn't have gone out there and been shelled and the command was as bad as Jake Brent's looks right now and made the roster. I think it could have been a scenario where he gets bumped out for one of the non-roster invites or one of the minor league deal guys. It was a possibility, but I wanted to see what the stuff would look like in spring, and that's going to be postponed for a little bit. It opens the door, though. I was asked about if this opens the door for Zach Greinke, a reunion there. Better chance than what it was at a few weeks ago, but I would say this more so opens the door for Daniel Lynch. I think it opens the door for Alec Marsh, Jonathan Bowen, Anthony Veneziano, Tyler Duffy, Sam Long, Dan Altavia. Those guys feel like the ones that are going to get the most looks. Not so much a 40-year-old guy that's clearly not getting that much interest from the rest of teams in Major League Baseball. Not going to rule it out, and not going to rule out Carlos Hernandez being there on the opening day roster. But when you have a setback and things didn't go as well in the live BP, I'd imagine, as we see in baseball all the time, it lingers a little bit, or at least you overcompensate for how much rest somebody needs. And right now, that's the most important thing, getting Carlos Hernandez some rest. And once he feels 100%, feel like there's no issues, that's when you go try to ramp things back up again. Okay, for our next segment, I want to dive into Michael Wacha's one inning today. It was an impressive one, and there is a little bit of information that we might be able to use for the regular season. We'll talk about that next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jack Johnson. Be sure to give me a follow on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Before we go any further, want to give a shout out to one of our sponsors today in eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors is covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Well, earlier today, there was split squad action for the Kansas City Royals. They won one game, lost the other. I believe it was the Rockies game they were able to hang on to, the one Daniel Lynch started, and they had the game slip away from them late in the game that Michael Wacha started against the San Diego Padres. And that is where we're going to lean toward today, because this was the first opportunity for Michael Wacha to showcase, what he's got. And veterans in this rotation, veterans in this bullpen, veterans in the lineup, it's about staying healthy. If you're a pitcher, make sure the stuff looks good. And I know that I'm going to keep hammering that point in. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it is the reality. Veterans, I do not care about the numbers. I do not care about the strikeouts. I don't care about the walks. I don't care about the runs. If you are working on stuff you need to work on, that's all that really matters. And your health, of course, is something that matters. Now, Michael Wacha today faced a lot of starters in the San Diego Padres lineup, or at least the first and only three guys he faced in the lineup today, which was Fernando Tatis, a top 100 prospect, and Jackson Merrill. And then it was Manny Machado hitting in the 3-hole. And he struck out both Tatis and Machado. And we got to see some of those highlights in MLB.com. Changeup looked really good. I'm not going to go as far to say that I was as blown away by Michael Wacha's stuff in the way that I was about Cole Reagan's on Sunday. But it was impressive. It was as perfect as you could have for an outing. And if I'm being quite honest, for the starters in this rotation, for the bullpen guys, I don't want 2 innings. I don't want 3 innings. I just want one. Like Michael Wacha's outing was exactly what I would be looking for. The next time Reagans takes the bump, the next time Lugo takes the bump, 1 inning, 15 pitches, 10 strikes, 2 strikeouts, move along. Go about your day. Go run some polls if you want to. But to me, it is so refreshing, I think, to have this balance now in the rotation. And we discussed it a little bit about Seth Lugo yesterday. But to me, it's refreshing to know you've got your high-end guy. You've got your big-time boom prospect. You've got the headliner, right? You've got your Mike Tyson. But you need those guys right behind him that still can throw their weight around a little bit. They just don't have the knockout punch. But to me, when I look at a Michael Wacha, when I look at a Seth Lugo, they both have pitches that you go, that's above average. That is some pretty high-end stuff. It's not blow you away, but it is a pitch that's going to get a lot of outs. And to me, the changeup that Michael Wacha possesses is one that allowed him to have so much success in San Diego last year. And it's also the same pitch I'd expect him to go to a lot here in Kansas City. Now, about that regular season stat that I brought up, it's something that we can utilize as we progress through spring training, is that this came from David Lesky, a great follow on Twitter. Great stuff on Inside the Crown. Go and subscribe to that. But DB Lesky on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it. And he pointed out that with Michael Wacha starting today, you could go every single fifth day, and that would put Michael Wacha as the opening day starter on March 28th against the Minnesota Twins. It also would put Seth Lugo as the number 2. And then Cole Reagans would be the number 3. He would start that Sunday against Minnesota, and you'd kick things off in the Baltimore series with Brady Singer. Not the way I'd assemble the rotation, and who knows? It can go a couple of different ways. But I guess it wouldn't shock me in the end if Mac Quatrero and the coaching staff clearly don't want to put the pressure on Cole Reagans. I push back on that. You know my thoughts on Cole Reagans. So you have this type of stuff. You're a dark horse to lead the league in strikeouts, dark horse to win a Cy Young. I don't want him as my number 2 or number 3. I want him as my number 1. But again, I'm not going to throw a hissy fit about Michael Wacha being the opening day starter, because at the end of the day, he's paid to have a pretty big role on this team. And I do think, along with Seth Lugo, as we discussed in yesterday's episode, he's going to have the stuff that you can count on every single fifth day. Where I think a lot of the guys last year, the stuff had to be on. Like, they had to wake up, have a good bullpen, get to the mound. The weather had to be good. The matchups had to be right. And then it was still hope and pray a little bit. There's going to be a lot of great times this season where you can hand the ball to Seth Lugo and Michael Wacha and just know it. They're going to have good stuff on that night. You know they're going to be reliable. You know they're going to be consistent. I'm not taking that from one inning of spring training. I'm not doing that at all. I'm going off last year, and I'm going over the course of his career. Michael Wacha's traditionally always been that guy that you hand the ball to, and it's, go give us 5 or 6. You know, I said that about Seth Lugo. Wacha's got a better chance to go deeper into games just because he's got more starting experience than Seth Lugo does. And I think he's got a better wipeout pitch than Seth Lugo does. The changeup that Michael Wacha possesses and the one that he got a sword on with Manny Machado in this game, it's going to get a lot of swings and misses this season. And it's been very clear this offseason as this roster has come into shape, as we have figured out the game plan for J.J. Piccolo and John Sherman, the type of pitchers they wanted to acquire. You know, you look at the guys that are available, the high-end guys that are still out there, a Blake Snell, a Jordan Montgomery. Of course, Scott Boras is the agent. You know, that is going to make it very difficult to negotiate with that player. But I don't think they were ever interested in those two guys. And if you're still holding out hope for a Snell or Montgomery, I'm going to tell you right now, give up on that hope. I would be floored, jaw on the floor, absolutely starstruck at the idea of Snell and Montgomery having to wait this entire offseason, and then the Royals have some of this money sitting around somewhere. To me, it felt like they always had their sights set on these two guys, and for big-time reasons. That they were affordable, number one. You had to pay them a good chunk of money, but they were in the wheelhouse. They were affordable to bring to Kansas City. Whereas a Snell or Montgomery are waiting for a lot of money. They're waiting for somebody to get desperate enough and drop the bag for a lot of years. Scott Boras does that with a lot of his agents. But to me, these are just two perfect fits for Kansas City. And not a lot of people are going to be just gushing over this rotation. They're really not. It's going to take some time for people to really buy into this rotation. And it may never work. You don't know. Baseball has a thing for being not so much predictable. I could have just said unpredictable there. I was getting tongue twisted, so I might as well just pivot. But to me, it's really a rotation that if these two guys can look like they did last year, Brady Singer bounces back and Cole Reagans becomes what you expect him to, well, then you have a decent-looking rotation. Not the power arm, lights out, going to get 10 Ks every single outing type of rotation. We're not going over with that. We're looking at a rotation that can just be a winning rotation. You take the ball every fifth day and it's next man up. Not many 2-inning outings, not many 3-inning outings. And Michael Wacha is going to have a big responsibility in that. Good stuff today. I expect good stuff throughout this spring. But more importantly, as I'm going to continue to say time and time again, stuff and health. That's all I care about. And today, A+ and A+. Okay, before we move on to our final segment, I want to give a shout out to Locked On Sports Today. It's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now, available on the free Fire TV channels app. When we return, who is this Walter Pennington guy, and what is he doing in spring training to catch my eye? That's next on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Jack Johnson. Be sure to give me a follow on Twitter or X at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. And you can find us on wherever you get your podcasts. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts. We're also on Odyssey, and we are on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. Before we go any further, let's give a shout out to one of the other sponsors today in FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. And you know that the college basketball conference tournaments are right around the corner. NCAA March Madness, college baseball, full swing, Major League Baseball in full swing. There's lots of different things you can look into, but I strongly urge you to go over to FanDuel, create your account today, and start winning some money. Start placing those bets. Those prop bets are where I think a lot of the good money is involved, and that, to me, is where you can win a lot of money. But do so over on FanDuel and create your account today. Well, one of the surprises of spring training, and surprise, no pun intended, has been a name that I don't think a lot of people recognize, and a name that most people didn't give much attention last year, mainly because the Royals lost 106 games, and there were few guys that you were just eager to see get to Kansas City. There were a few, of course. I remember pounding the table for Anthony Veneziano for a point in time, Jonathan Bolin, Alec Marsh. I think on the hitting side, you looked at somebody like Nick Lofton, Samad Taylor. There were options. There were guys that it was like, just give them a chance. Let's see if they can shine. But for the most part, when you're out of it by mid-April, it's hard to really pay close attention to who's next, because you get to a point where it doesn't really matter who's next. This team's not going to be competitive. This team's not going to be that fun to watch. But Walter Pennington was one of those guys that I thought quietly had a really good season. Strikeout numbers were pretty good. He was striking out more than one guy per inning. You look at the ERA, it was in the 3.1s, the teens areas. I think it was 3.18, if I'm not mistaken. There was some good numbers for Walter Pennington last year, which is why I think the Royals looked at him and said, this is somebody that we can give a non-roster invite. Let's see what he's got in spring training. And no, he's not starting games. He's not coming in there in the second or the third, where a lot of these guys who have really good chances to make the roster are throwing. He's been in that 5th, 6th, 7th inning range when games are featuring a lot of backups, a lot of minor leaguers, but he's doing exactly what a non-roster invite hopes to do. You want to impress with stuff that you can't really compete with. And right now, he's got a record that nobody else on the Royals has. He's faced 6 batters, and he struck out all 6. Now, I remember seeing some clips of Walter Pennington last year. I don't think it's stuff that is going to overpower you at the big league level. I do not think that he is somebody the Royals are actively looking at and saying, there's our fix. Jake Brentz has 7 walks and has only gotten 3 outs in spring training. Let's go with Walter Pennington. No, I think that they're much more looking at the guys I mentioned at the beginning of today's show. Daniel Lynch, Alec Marsh, Anthony Veneziano, Jonathan Bolin, Sam Long, Tyler Duffy, Dan Altavilla. Like, those guys are all ahead of Walter Pennington. But what's good for Walter Pennington and why I think it's important to have a spring training like this is that there is going to come a time this season where the Royals are going to probably be a little bit depleted in the bullpen. Guys are going to be banged up. Guys are going to be tired. And if he can pitch pretty much the same way he did last year, strikeout numbers are pretty good. You lower the walk rate just a bit. You're not getting lit up. And it's tough to pitch in Omaha, by the way. Pretty much no pitcher they brought up last year had good numbers down at that level. But to me, if you can just stay like that, repeat the numbers you had last year, there's no reason whatsoever the Royals won't turn to him in the middle of the season and say, need him for a road trip. And then if he can come up here, like an Austin Cox situation, you pitch well enough, hey, you're not going back. You can be somebody that hangs around. There's more mouths to feed, I guess I should say, with this roster. There's more bullpen guys. There's more stability there. But there's going to come a point in time where a rookie's going to get a chance. And Walter Pennington is going about it in a perfect way in spring training. Get yourself on the radar. Intrigue the coaches. And right now, hard not to be intrigued. 6 batters, 6 strikeouts. That's always going to pop up on a manager's radar. I'm sure that Matt Quatrero, Brian Sweeney, Zach Bove, Paul Hoover, all those guys are pretty impressed in the limited amount of time they've seen Walter Pennington down in Surprise, Arizona. So good stuff for him. Hoping for even better stuff in spring training. And then we can see if he's going to get a chance to pitch at the big league level in 2024. Well, that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Be sure to give me a follow on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Before we say goodbye, one last shout out to Locked On Sports Today. It's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now, available on the free Fire TV channels app. Tomorrow, we're going to break down a little bit more of what happened in Brady Singer's first outing and look ahead to what's on tap this weekend. But until then, you take it easy, Kansas City.